Hey everyone, and welcome back to our alphabetical taboo busting journey. And today we're going to talk about G for grief. And now we chose this topic not just because it is necessarily just a taboo, but because we feel like the different types of grief aren't really talked about that much. You know, people think about grief mostly when someone either has died or is dying, and they often think about it in the very linear format of going from sort of denial, anger, bargaining over to acceptance, and as if you accept and then the grief is over. But really, what we've found both through our personal experiences and studying psychology is that simply not the case. So we want to dive into a couple of different types of grief as well as the multifaceted nature of the grieving process. So Sylvia, welcome to the show again.
Good to see you, John Thor. So I'm so glad we're talking about this topic of grief. I know it's a difficult one to talk about, and I know a lot of people in the last couple of weeks and months have suffered loss. So I want to perhaps just take a moment to acknowledge that grief is a very heavy, tremendous thing to deal with, and especially in the midst of everything that's going on, I do also want to just acknowledge that there are some of us out there who are struggling with this right now. So perhaps to say I'm excited to talk about it is not quite the right word, but I am, I think, eager to dive in that, you know, even though I didn't lose anybody, luckily, in the last couple of months due to the pandemic, I think many of us, including myself, did suffer some kind of a loss, right? And yet until we were on this journey, or we started on this journey, I hadn't really thought about this notion of grieving something that is an offshoot of myself or intangible to myself. And what I'm referring to here is my past self, right? So I think about before March 15th, who I was or what I was doing. Now, who I was or am, essentially, right, the essence of it hasn't changed, right? I'm still who I am in many ways, yet my way of life is no longer, right? March 15th was sort of the date that separates the before and after. And I went through about 2 to 3 weeks of what I then called trauma brain, but now looking back really was me suffering that loss, or knowing that the past was no longer available. And I wasn't grieving, right? I just fought through it. And, luckily for me, it emerged in the form of creativity. So I was probably more prolific in that time period than I had ever been. Yet that was me channeling some sort of energy, right? That I really was overwhelmed by. Like, I didn't know what it was, how to take it forward, how to move on from it. And I just leaned into doing. So creating was my way of coping. Yet looking back, that was really grief, right? And I'm still doing that today, where I think about how I no longer travel the way I used to, as openly and liberally as I used to, right? There's some things that I love that I no longer can do in the same way. And I took my sanity stroll this morning, and I said goodbye to that, right? I finally was like, well, I'm going to say goodbye to that, and welcome a new chapter or a new way. Yet it really took me pausing, I think, and going, yeah, this is me letting go, and right, really acknowledging that, yeah, these last few weeks and months have been me coming to some sort of a grieving process, and to, definitively this morning go, okay, July 1's here, second half is here. This is time to redefine and reshape.
And I think, it's interesting, even if we take that very basic form of the grieving process, you can even just see it illustrated in America during Corona, because you see denial as the first step.
Yeah,
that certainly happened. Everyone went about their business as usual.
Yeah.
No one was going to change anything. Then there was bartering. It was like, well, maybe we can keep everything open if we stay slightly apart. Like, if you wear a mask into Costco, maybe. Then you see the anger with protesters showing up outside like a governor's house with guns, being like, we need haircuts and like beef jerky. And like, okay, no. I guess acceptance hasn't quite reached yet. It's sort of still a little bit delusional around the world. But it's interesting because people do go through that, and
Hmm.
people are talking about, for example, this whole situation around Corona or COVID,
Yeah.
being form of social grief.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's not the first time it's happened, but for
Hmm.
a lot of us, it's the first time we've experienced it. Like we've read about it
Yeah.
before, we
Yeah.
just never read about it as grief. We read
Yeah.
about the Great Depression. We read about, people struggling after a lot of difficult eras of
Mm-hmm.
time, regardless of whether they lost someone or not.
Yeah.
And I think that could be a discussion on its own, but I kind of want to hone in on those smaller, more personal types of grief
Hmm.
that still don't involve literally losing someone. Because
Yeah.
I think what you touched upon, losing your old sense of self in a way, is something that can happen in so many different ways. And there are these ideas of like ego death, where
Hmm.
people feel like they've lost that sense of self, and um, it often comes, I think people sometimes confuse the feelings around that with burnout, because
Hmm.
they're
Yeah.
very closely connected. You can have a lot of the same experiences, and
Hmm.
even in burnout you go through, in a way, a bit of a grieving process, because at some point you're going to have to face the facts that you got into burnout because you weren't doing things the right way.
Yeah.
And
And yeah, that is so timely because I think I mentioned in the last video for F, right? That this is a very timely period to discuss grief, in that about 2 years ago, almost to the day, I well, first I encountered a situation with somebody in the professional context that was very, very um, jarring, and very emotionally draining. And I remember one day just calling someone, one of my friends. I was like, I don't know how to describe what I'm feeling. It's so new and unusual. I have to just say it. And she had herself gone through something similar just about 4 weeks ahead of me. And she literally said, she goes, Sylvia, you're grieving. I go, no way, man. Like, I'm angry. Yes. Am I disappointed? Hell yeah. Right. Am I pissed off beyond belief? Yeah. Like, right. And like, am I vengeful and resentful? Probably. Right. She goes, no, really, what you're grieving is, right. You probably lost yourself, right. In the context of dealing with this person, you lost yourself in the context of this environment that you were in with this person professionally, and yet, right, it was eroding this whole time. Yet, right, what you're now looking back on is you feel like you walked out with nothing, right? That like all the pieces of you not only were broken, they were taken away and swept away. That's what you're really feeling like. So there's disappointment, yes. Is there burnout? Absolutely. Is there anger, denial, resentment, all that? But yes, she goes, what you're feeling that you can't put your finger on is grief, because you really came out feeling like that whole shell of you was completely eradicated. And now, and then she said, this is now your time to rebuild, right? Or you don't even have to think of it as rebuilding so much as like you now no longer have to deal with this bullshit, right? This crap. It's an opportunity to double down on the things you believe, whatever, right? Pivot, but know that you are entering a grieving process. And it astounded me, like that, like you said, right? It didn't even occur to me because nobody physically got hurt that I could see anyway. Emotionally, probably there were some injuries and damages, but again, it wasn't that physical. Like I couldn't see, right, that like this thing was washed away or put in the ground or right vanished in front of my eyes. Yet, yeah, it was this um, invisible loss that was very profound.
And I think people do connect it to that classic depiction of grief, even down to expecting the process to again be very linear.
Mm,
That, once you get to this point, it's just done, no more
mm,
grieving.
mm,
But it's just not realistic. Whether you've lost someone or not,
yeah,
you go back and forth between stages. You might start somewhere else than you think. And it's just like so many things with feelings, it might
yeah,
not be 100% logical.
yeah.
Um, and
Hmm.
like for me, one of the most deeply personal and difficult encounters with grief are, to be completely frank and lay something quite personal out on the table, is with my mother.
Hmm.
Um, she's alive, yet I no longer have a relationship with her based on her decisions and actions, which were incredibly hurtful and
Mm,
difficult to deal with. And similar to your story, I didn't really put together that it was grief
mm,
until, and I'd love to say it was, a smart friend or a psychologist that helped me, although my my therapist really helped me deal with it and work through it. But
mm,
what made me truly realize it was grief was BoJack Horseman. And it's the weirdest thing, but that
mhm.
cartoon horse has to be one of the most relatable characters on TV ever.
I'm gonna put
Uh,
that on my list now.
Yeah, put that on your list because
Yes.
there are a couple of episodes that deal specifically with his relationship with his mother,
Mm,
and there are elements of it that reminded me so much of mine.
yeah.
And especially there was this line where he said something like, "I'm not truly grieving her. I'm grieving the relationship we never had." And that line hit me so damn hard
Mm.
that I genuinely took about a year away from the show after that because
Wow.
I felt like I needed to take a step back to just
Yeah.
deal with all of the emotions and all of the years of emotions that
Mm,
that one phrase just kind of hit
yeah.
me with. And and it's just it's weird to think about, but at the same time it's something that I feel a lot more at ease to talk about now than I would have over the past
Mm,
few years. It's
mhm.
still, not going to lie, difficult to mention. And before recording this, I probably went back and forth about 12 times in my head whether or not to bring it up. But
Mm,
I think it's important now that we are talking about taboos that we
mm,
break through those barriers. And, if we expect people to discuss these taboos, I think we need to be willing to break through those ourselves. And for me, as an example, when I talked this through with a therapist, one of the things that she always focused on was it isn't a linear process. It is not a one size fits all process. It's something that you will go through. And she said maybe for years to come you'll go back and forth because
mm,
really you might feel like you get closure,
mm,
but something could make it come all flooding back. You could go back and forth, but the important thing is to allow yourself to do
mm,
that, to
mm,
allow yourself to feel what you feel, recognize
mm,
it and acknowledge it,
mhm.
and deal with it and work through.
Yeah, your example of the cartoon horse was really poignant for me in that um, this was probably, goodness gracious, like 25 years ago. And my friend's mother took us out shopping, my friend and me, right? And I remember crying in the dressing room because her mom was helping me, like, try on things, like, zip things up. And like she was being the type of mother that I didn't grow up with, right? So again, like physically, I had a mother, yet I didn't have that relationship, that nurturing sensation, right, from my own mother. And here's someone else's mother. And I remember just like crying in the middle of a Gap dressing room in Ohio. Like, you're just like, what's wrong with her? But again, she was so nurturing. And what's interesting is, like you said, right, like I didn't know that in a way that was my expression of grief, right, that I really, even that at that age, really didn't have a relationship with my own maternal, entity at home. And throughout my life, I would have these little triggers. So it is not linear, and it could be a long time, right, in terms of processing and dealing. Like there's still days when, like I think I like you, I've come to terms with some things. I'm now thinking about forgiveness and how to move forward, right, in the way that I think would be honoring my values and my boundaries and things like that. But there's still that process of like, yeah, I still get triggered, I guess is what I'm saying. That, right, I'll see something, or I'll like, Mother's Day is always a trigger. And or I'll
Yeah.
be out and about, yeah, seeing things, and it'll be like, ooh, and yet for me, I think I'll just round it out by saying, and then I'd love to announce what H is for us for next week, is that I think my grieving process was really centered on like not the not having, right, so it wasn't even a person I was grieving, it was not so much the relationship itself, but I think it was grieving the loss of a need not met, if that makes sense. So or the grieving that, right, this very primal and primitive need was really not there, or was not met. So, it in talking about this now, it is really difficult. Yet, like I'm kind of looking at myself from like 30,000 foot. I'm kind of like, but that is a type of grief that I don't think gets talked about as much either.
Absolutely agree. And I think it is important to talk about because in some ways it can feel more difficult to deal with that specific type of grief
Yeah.
because it's not as much talked about and
Right.
because it might feel difficult to find closure when the
Mhm.
person you're grieving is still there, as
Yeah.
weird as that is
Yeah.
to say.
Right. Yeah.
But I'll wrap that up because we could probably talk about this for days. But H is going to be an interesting episode because I'm going to leave you completely in the dark as to what exactly it is. But we're going to do H for home. You might be wondering, how is home a taboo? Well, I guess you'll just have to tune in next week to find out.
Exactly. Well, see you then, my friend.
See you then.